Okay, welcome everyone to another video brought to you by chess.com and Daniel Rensch. Today we are almost complete with our series of Rook endings. Hopefully you've gone through the entire video series, and so now you're ready for some really masterful stuff today. Kind of joking, but seriously, we're going to start out today with some practical tricks and ideas. I like to call this practical ideas and tricks, actually. And what we're going to try to talk about are some positions from real games, some positions where we're going to use some of the ideas that we've learned throughout this whole series and watching these videos and try to put them into practice in some of our games and some practical situations. So we're starting with a position here that is, it's actually white to move right now. But the real problem starts now after white goes after this pawn, trying to equalize the situation so that he has a pass pawn to match your pass pawn on the outside. Now, what's interesting about this is that in the game, the player made a big mistake and figured that his outside pass pawn might be enough because it would be harder for this king to get to and the rook to guard because it's an outside pass pawn. So not bad logic, especially for a king and pawn ending. However, in rook endings, typically, unless you get your rook in the most active or let's say the most accurate situation, it can backfire on you, even up material. Even if, let's say, black was right about trying to come down and push this pawn, and right about the fact that his king would be much closer to this pawn than your king and rook are close to this pawn. Even if black was right about that, the real problem was that white still had no losing chances once he put his rook behind the pawn, because of the fact that he has no other weaknesses. To emphasize that, we're going to show that when this king moves, and even if white was to push this pawn, and let's say white was even to just give up this pawn at some point, one of the problems would be, let's say he doesn't do it yet, actually. Let's say he hides the king, and we push down, and now we reach that critical point, if you've seen some of the other positions we've analyzed, where if you push your pawn to the 7th rank, your rook is now stuck. And so if black was to do that, here's an example where white could even just give up the pawn as long as his king stays safe on the king side. To emphasize our idea one more time, the point is that black is not really threatening anything, because as soon as he touches the pawn, white will give check, the king will have to move away, and white will go back. White could even give a couple more checks if he wants to be annoying. But bottom line is, the king has no place to hide when the rook and the pawn are together on the 1st and 2nd rank here. So, even with an outside pass pawn, without weaknesses on the other side of the board, as we see here, white doesn't really have any problems. You really have to look to get your rook in a better situation than just the typical in front of the pawn. So here's a moment right here. This was the beginning of our problem, if you remember. White went to get this pawn. And here's a moment right here where I would recommend pausing the video and taking a second to try to solve this position and see what you might come up here as black. Would you try to go after this pawn? Would you do similar to what happened in the game with another idea, or would you come up with something else different altogether? And that's what the correct plan was here for black. So go ahead and pause the video, and we're going to assume that you're back now. And so the correct idea for black was to give check. And now if white were to come up, obviously this would be a nice idea, because we could pick up this pawn and probably have enough to win with the 2 pawns. However, when the king moves back, we're not able to pick up that pawn. So what was the purpose of the check? The idea was to try to come back down around to get behind your pawn. As typical, and we've said in other videos, rook should always be behind the pawns, whether that means you're trying to defend or win, actually. If your rook is behind the pawn, you're in the best situation. So even if white tried not to take the pawn for a moment, by giving this check, we could block the check, and now he would be forced to go through with his plan of capturing the pawn, allowing us to bring the rook back behind the pawn, where black is now headed for an easy win, believe it or not. Just the difference of the rook position gives black an easy winner, and at the very least, much, much better winning chances. With white having only 2 pawns on this side of the board and really no weaknesses to speak of, still going to be a difficult win. But we're going to try to play it out here and show what the basic concept and why it's so much better to have your rook behind the pawn rather than in front of the pawn. So let's say white tries to come around and he realizes that okay, he's not going to get a queen before you do because your king can easily stop it. So let's say he brings the rook down to what the best situation would be, which would be to block the pawn of the third rank. Typically, you'll see this in a lot of rook endgame books. A lot of people will advise you that if your rook is to get stuck in front of the pawn, always best to do it as soon as you can. So bringing it to the third rank was actually White's most optimal defense here. So after White does this, we're able to bring our king forward, and really it doesn't take much to see what the problem here is. The difference of the rook being in front of the pawn versus behind the pawn gives it so much less mobility and options that almost any mistake can lose now. If the rook were to ever move out in front of the pawn, he would have no time to give checks or to come after anything, because you see we're only a few squares from queening. And furthermore, which is kind of one of the real important points, and one of the things we've talked about throughout this series, which is thinking a little bit backwards to forwards, which is like, if the pieces were to be traded, are you winning in the king of pawn ending? Where, well, here, for example, if White is to come over and try to win the pawn, at the time of taking the pawn, you'll notice that his king will always be, not even really close to trying to defend this situation. Now, if he tries to sit, once we've made some progress, at some point here, he's going to run into the issue. We've created a target now on g2, so let's say he takes it and he's still sitting. At some point now, he'll run into the problem where we have created, I guess you would call it a weakness on this side of the board. We have created another target, another problem for him, because our pawn is now so far advanced. So one really easy example might be coming over to try to come down and win this pawn. In fact, I think the most accurate way to do it would be to come to the d file. And I'll show you why in 1 second. But before I do, please notice that even if the king takes now, you would still have the opportunity to check and trade rooks. And if the rook takes now, you would still have the opportunity to check and take rooks. So the best thing he might be able to do is to come down and defend on the second rank. But after we make our progress, even if he was to take here, once again, it's obvious we could check. But just to prove the point, this is also a win. The point is that once we've created this target, this other weakness, and I consider it a target or a weakness because our pawns are so far advanced. Once we've created that problem for him, even an idea like trading rooks this way by cutting the rook off along the rank is also going to be a win. Because any defense he might have now, there is no frontal attack defense, from other videos we've done. There is no chance of his king getting back in front of the pawn. There's nothing he can really do. His king is too far, and black is going to win this endgame based on the fact that that this pawn is too close, and even a basic Lucina idea or something like that. So let's back up and take a look at that one more time. After White comes over to win the pawn, we find this wonderful combination, which I'm sure you found when we paused the video. And when the king moved, we transferred our rook to behind the pawn, which is the key point of this practical idea. He did the best defense he could, which was come to the third rank, but even that was not enough to stop black from coming in. And you'll notice that I moved the king this way, which allowed me to come to the king side and advance the pawns. But there really isn't much else he can do either, because if the king goes this way, what are we going to do? Well, obviously, we're going to run over here and help our rook and pawn to become a queen. And only so much he can sit. He can sit if he wants, but eventually, as you know, sitting doesn't last forever. And the truth is, the more you push a pawn, the more it becomes closer to the king, or even gets closer to being undefended by the rook. If you were to push it to the fourth rank, for example, and black was to make a waiting move, all of a sudden, white has real problems. Either he moves this way, allowing us to come into the queen side, or he moves this way, allowing a similar problem on the king side. And this position is lost based on the fact that the rook is in front of the pawn, not in the best defensive position. And so back to our original idea or trick, the point of this position was recognizing our opportunity based on these technical pieces of knowledge that we've picked up throughout our watching these videos. We seize the opportunity, and we recognize that our rook is going to be much better behind the pawn, and we head into an endgame where black is now going to be winning pretty much no matter what white does. So that's position one, and I hope that that's kind of a simple way. I wanted to keep this position simple to show you a very important idea. It's a very important idea to not miss your opportunity to get your pieces on the right squares, the most optimal squares for allowing you to win. I think sometimes people push and push or push a pawn and get to the end of a position, and they don't realize that maybe they missed an opportunity to get their pieces on more optimal squares. And so that's a pretty common mistake even by masters. So, okay, so with that being said, now we are going to clear this position and set up another one for you, another practical idea or trick, if you will. We're going to start in this position here. And again, I only made white moves first because it's easier to do that on the board. But the position is to be solved from here. White is, in fact, the more accurate setup of the position. We're going to start with this position here to show that white was trying to. I'm sorry. Let's start with the accurate position. I'm slowing up a little bit here because I want to make sure we get all the ideas in. So sorry we lost a few seconds there, but here we go. So as white tries to bring his king to the front of the pawn and in order to set up a Philidor idea, he's obviously got his rook behind the pawn, which, if he was able to get a Philidor and give some checks, that'd be nice. But the rook is not really in an optimal position there on e5 because of a trick that black has. So let's go ahead and take a second to try to see what our best option would be in this position. Okay, we're going to assume you're back. And so looking at this position, you could try to make some slow progress by, shuffling the king to a side and try to hope that your rook could check his king away to get a Lucina idea. But the most accurate thing to do is recognize one of the other important winning methods we've talked about, which is if you ever have a chance to cut off the king along the file, you should take that opportunity. So here the winning move for black is simply king to f4, gaining a tempo on the rook. And this, again, is from a real game, a practical game, and it kind of explains the awkward position of the rook, because if we were solving a random position where the white pieces were in optimal defensive squares, this rook would probably be back from the pawn. But here we were in a game with doubled pawns. I remember the game. White captured a pawn here and then tried to bring the king close. And he didn't have time to remove his rook from this tempo by black. So black was able to attack the rook and immediately follow that move by cutting off the king. And so now you've created a situation where even if checks occur, if you're able to hide your king behind your pawn, you know what you're headed towards because you've watched all of our wonderful chess.com videos, and that is you're headed for a Lucina. The king's going to hide in front, and he's going to try to maintain some sort of defensive chances, but we're going to make our progress. He's going to be giving some checks. We're going to make our progress, eventually reach our goal position of the Lucina, and now the win is easy because we remember the idea. We give check, bring our rook up to the 4th rank, or in this case, because it's black, the 5th rank, and white can wait or do whatever, but now that our rook has improved its position, he's not able to stop the eventual goal of the Lucina position, where the king and rook provide that bridge of protection for the pawn that we talked about, probably why it's called the bridge. So, okay, starting from the beginning position, we see that just a very quick practical trick and idea. Hope you found this move, followed it by the cutoff of the king, seizing your goal position, recognizing what the ultimate goal is of a lot of these rook endings when you're trying to win, which is a Lucina position. And hopefully you saw that idea and you executed it in your own games, and now you are ready to be a rook ending master, or at least until our next position. Okay, so our next position here, one of my favorite positions, and a surprisingly useful position to know, I think. Even though it seems a little bit extravagant, this is a surprisingly useful position to know, because whenever you're on the worst side of an endgame, we all like to know how to win, but a lot of us don't take the time to learn accurate drawing ideas, I would say, or how to be good defenders, how to make life difficult for our opponents. And here we're looking at a position where white brought the rook up to defend the pawn. This was a huge mistake rather than keeping the rook behind the pawn. And it allowed black for a trick here that would be surprising. It's surprising to many people. But something to keep in mind, because you may get a position like this where the rook was already along one of the lateral ranks here, whether it be the 4th rank or the 5th rank, defending a pawn. When the rook was already along a lateral rank, this idea we're about to see is very important and might be more common, despite how extravagant it is. It might be more common than you think. And the reason why White played this move, by the way, is because he figured, hey, the rook is stuck in front of the pawn. My king is about 2 squares from coming over, and this game is over, right? This game should be an easy win for White. White got a little bit careless in defending the pawn because the game should be over. The king is going to come over and attack the rook. No way this rook can hold on these squares when the king comes up and helps this pawn start to make its progress. Obviously, if that pawn just gets a few squares further, Black might as well resign. So White played Rook b4, not because he was totally retarded. It was actually a 2250 rated player, but he figured the game was over. He figured that White's chances of winning were, pretty much not even chances anymore, almost certainty. And so he put the rook on a careless square. So let's take a moment here and pause and reflect and think about what you might do here as Black. I mean, all we've talked about in terms of the ideas here is how bad the rook is when it's stuck in front of the pawn. So even with this slight mistake by White, how can you take advantage of that? I mean, what kind of crazy spells or concoctions has Danny thought up with this position? Because it looks to me like White is about to win in just a couple moves. So let's take a moment. We're going to assume you're going to pause the video. Okay, and you're back, and now we see the wonderful answer that we know you solved because you're brilliant, and that's why you're on chess.com. And that is, Black recognized that this rook guarding this pawn, although it seemed optimal at the time because his opponent was about to win easily. White was about to win easily by bringing the king over. He guarded the pawn, guarding this pawn, preventing any chances by Black. And so, what could possibly be wrong with this? Well, we found what was wrong with it, and that is that the rook, by coming to the 4th rank, created a little bit of a trap of our king. And so when White makes a little bit of progress here, all of a sudden, we're in a position where, what's going on with our king over here? No squares to move to. And so White has an easy draw by taking this pawn. Sorry, Black has an easy draw by taking the 4th rank pawn. And what's interesting to notice is that once this rook committed to the 4th rank, if you recognize this trick, if you can remember this idea and see this trick in a practical game, you may be surprised what kind of position you're able to set up. This is obviously from a real game, as I said, all of these are. But although it seems a little bit of an extravagant stalemate trick, something you might see in a crazy problem book, I think it's more practical than you realize because a lot of the time we get careless with our moves and our opponents get careless with their moves. And in fact, Rook b4 seemed logical at the time because it was, hey, I'm going to stop my opponent from making any progress with his king. I'm going to guard my pawn and then I'm going to bring my king over and the game is over. But it turned out that our ability to recognize the awkward position of our own king, the stalemated position of our own king, helped us in finding a surprising defense, which was that we were stalemated. Now, you should notice that this move does not achieve stalemate because he doesn't have to take with the king. He can take with the rook, and now you've been freed, and this is a cage that maybe rarely we're unhappy to be freed from this cage because our only chance was this stalemate trick. So the only chance to draw is to take the 4th rank pawn, keeping the rook in its powerful position. The wonderful idea that he had of defending this pawn has now backfired, and Black was able to draw this game. So one more time, how is this going to affect your games? Well, again, I mean, imagine a position, not that hard to imagine, where you've got a king in 3, versus, a king and a 3 on one side of the board, and he's got another pawn. In that position, unless you're able to get your rook to that optimal defensive square, or you have no weaknesses on this side of the board, as we've talked about, if those things are true, if you have no weaknesses and your rook is behind the pawn, well, then you've achieved a draw anyway. But sometimes that doesn't happen, and here you see that, even with our pawns being a little bit extended and our king being in an awkward position and our rook in a bad place, keeping our wits about us and keeping some ideas in that little database of our head can help us. And when White got careless, just because he didn't want to calculate the lazy idea of this, which should have been an easy win because this pawn and this king are way too close, but because White didn't want to calculate that idea, he committed the rook to a square that guarded this pawn as well as this pawn, and figured he was in an easily winning position. So you see how this could actually happen in a real game. And Black recognized his opportunity to trap his own king and create kind of an extravagant stalemate idea that his opponent did not see coming at all. Okay, so that concludes our 10th video here, which is practical ideas and tricks. Not as technical as some of the other things we've talked about throughout this series, you know, talking about just important ideas and techniques that if you want to be a rook ending master, you just absolutely have to know. Here we saw some positions from real games where your database of knowledge of all those things that you learned, all those technical ideas and positions can help you when you get to these practical games. Things like getting your rook on the optimal position, things like recognizing the awkwardness of your opponent's king. And here we see an example of recognizing the awkwardness of your own king's position and seizing an opportunity for a stalemate idea that, believe it or not, has happened in more than one game, even at high levels. So not something as far-fetched as you might think. And hopefully my explanations of this position showed you that. So thank you very much, and hope you enjoyed this video. A little tongue-tied right now, but it nonetheless was a rook ending video that improved your knowledge, and now you're ready to go out in the world and beat grandmasters in rook endings. So very good luck to you. Thank you.